The morning panel is devoted to the topic of energy usage, and Dave Lawrence will moderate the panel. Dave Lawrence is currently a director of Stone Energy Corporation. Before joining Stone Energy, he served as executive vice president of exploration and commercial for Shell Upstream Americas, and he was the functional head of global exploration for Royal Dutch Shell from 2009 until his retirement in 2013. Dave's also an earth scientist, and he received his doctorate from the Department of Geology and Geophysics here at Yale, 1983. Is that right, Dave? 1983?
I was late, 84.
Or 84. All right. We're quite happy to have him here. He's been a member of the External Advisory Board for the Yale Climate and Energy Institute since its start in 2009. And I'm also pleased to announce that Dave has accepted our invitation to serve as the new chair of the YCEI Advisory Board. So I'll let Dave introduce the rest of the panel.
Thanks, Mark. Well, like Neil, it's great to be with this group of panelists who I think represents a range of expertise and a diversity of views that I think will be greatly beneficial to us. I should say I'm very pleased to take this chairmanship role of the External Advisory Board for YCEI, given the leadership and the direction that it's had in the past and the potential that I see for it to have an impact in not only areas of technology and science, but also in the regulatory space and in the communications space and in policy space. So it's a tremendous institution with a lot of horsepower behind it, and sessions like this, I think, just go a long way towards demonstrating that. Neil, I thought it was great to present us with these Shell scenarios, and the Shell scenarios provide a plausible, and he really emphasized that, I hope you took that away, plausible scenarios that lead to this amount of energy use by sector, this amount of energy use by different geopolitical realms, and therefore this amount of carbon emissions, and this is different consequences. But I also think that you recognized that in those scenarios there wasn't very much difference in the early years, and in the end they all resulted in a significantly higher amount of carbon in the atmosphere, which calls for what are some disruptive technologies that may come forward. What will change the rate of market penetration that we see, which is an area of great interest to me. And I'm highly cognizant of, as we look at different introductions of different energy systems, that there are things now that we see that we didn't envision 10 years ago. And the quote that we tend to overestimate change in 3 years and underestimate it in 10 in the energy space, I think is highly valid. I like that quote in the comments. But we remember 10 years ago we were looking at LNG imports in the US, and now we're looking at LNG exports. The greatest change in the energy space has come in natural gas, which was a dying industry, and now look at, in these scenarios, how much it's taken its role in a 10-year span. It was not like that 10 years ago. So what are the other technologies, what other policies, regulations, things that could cause these scenarios, as Neil so eloquently presented, to change for us? And I think that's why it's great that we've been able to bring forward this panel, which is a panel of, again, it's a considerable expertise in a diversity of fields, in a diversity of geographies and sectors. So let me just introduce the panel to you, and I'll start with Dan. Dan is Hillhouse Professor, Dan Esty, who many of you have met, is Hillhouse Professor of Environmental Law and Policy, with appointments at both the Yale Law School and the Yale School of Forestry and Environmental Studies. He served the state of Connecticut as Commissioner of the Connecticut Department of Energy and Environmental Protection. Dan is also the author and editor of numerous publications, highly influential publications, and books including Green to Gold, How Smart Companies Use Environmental Strategies to Innovate, Create Value, and Build. So he'll bring, I think, a tremendous perspective to our panel. Professor Zhang Xiliang is one of the leading economists in China, highly influential in one of the most highly influential places on the planet, working on climate and energy policy. I hope I'm not underestimating it. I underestimate in 3 years, 10 years, no. But he is. So he's worth listening to. And he's professor of economics and executive director of the Institute of Energy, Environment, and Economy at Tsinghua University in Beijing. He's authored and led many studies, important studies, and initiatives in China, and was a lead author in the last 2 IPCC climate change projects. So welcome. It's a privilege to have you, and thank you for traveling this great distance. Dan did not need to travel a great distance. Another great traveler is our next panelist is Karen Hussey, is an associate professor at the Fenner School of Environment and Society at Australian National University, and an expert on what is now being called the Water Energy Climate Nexus, which also, I thought that was great, Karen, that Neil also raised that important point in his introduction. She has a book coming out later this year on that topic specifically, so we'll look forward to its publication. Next. Yes, and buying that, and it'll be from Cambridge University Press. And she's the author of Environment and Sustainability, a Policy Handbook. So welcome, Karen. Thank you again for traveling, and she'll provide us also some unique perspectives. And Luke Tonachel is a highly respected senior vehicle analyst for the National Natural Resources Defense Council. He's based in New York. I note that today Luke walked here, which was good. Well done, Luke. And where he studies ways to reduce the environmental impacts of the world's transportation system. And again, you can think of that impact as you looked at one of Neil's charts specifically on what will happen with liquid transport fuels and what may change that through time. He also served in the U.S. Navy, so that brought him a lot of perspective on operations and propulsion as an officer on a Navy cruiser. So welcome, Luke. Now in our panel, everybody's been given kind of strict instructions, we'll see how we do, to stay within somewhere between 5 and 10 minutes. And for their opening remarks, that'll give us a useful perspective. And then we'll open the discussion to the panelists for discussion. I'll ask some questions. The panelists, you're welcome to ask each other questions. And most importantly, we welcome questions from the room. So we're going to leave ample time, I think, for a good and open discussion. And with that, I think I'll turn over to you, Dan, to start off.
Thanks very much. And speed up our movement from presentations and opening comments to conversation. I'll stay seated. And I do think the conference that's been organized here focuses on a critical issue at a critical moment, which is the world is changing very fast. A lot of the assumptions we had about what the world would look like in the years ahead have been radically shifted in the last few years, 3-4 years. So the world going out to 2030 looks very different today from what people asked the same question would have said at the turn of the century, for example, 15 years ago. Obviously, the biggest piece of that in some regards is the emergence of shale gas, tight oil, and the real revolution in the potential for fossil fuels continuing to play a central role in our energy future for a much longer time than some people had thought. But I think at the same time, we see mounting pressure, despite policy failures, particularly in Washington and to some degree internationally, on the issue of climate change, and a growing recognition that that pressure has to be responded to and will be responded to one way or another. And having just come from the experience of working in a state government, I feel actually optimistic that the United States is going to respond. And I say that despite the fact that Washington is clearly dithering and has not been able to create a strategy that really helps grapple with this world of change that's emerged in the energy arena. But I am excited to see companies taking these issues on frontally. Neil's presentation on Shell was a fascinating example of a company stepping up at the heart of this issue in very creative ways. A $40 shadow price on carbon, that's an extremely interesting way for a company to position itself for success in the years ahead, and not simply to wait to be buffeted by regulatory change or other factors that might overtake it. And I would tell you, just as companies are stepping up, so too are a number of states. And Connecticut, for example, under Governor Malloy, created for the first time ever a comprehensive energy strategy. For the longest time, states thought that energy was national policy and it could be left to Washington. Nobody today thinks that that is a wise place to leave your state and to leave its citizens and, frankly, to leave your businesses in a very competitive marketplace. So you see states stepping up, and I think in Connecticut there were some interesting signals about what the policy framework of the future has to look like and how smart governments are aligning incentives to be ready for the change that's coming. Some of it doesn't seem like rocket science, but it is important. For example, I was head of a Department of Energy and Environmental Protection. The acronym was DEEP, D-E-E-P. But I used to joke, and the governor actually insisted, that we spell DEEP with 3 E's. Energy, the environment, and the economy as an integrated set of issues that had to be understood as a package that needed to be thought through on an integrated basis. And I think in the energy arena more broadly, we're seeing a very significant change from a 20th century approach to energy to a new 21st century approach. And to caricature slightly, but not too greatly, the 20th century approach had a bunch of smart folks, some of them at least at the Department of Energy in Washington, from a U.S. perspective this is, trying to pick winners, winning technologies, winning industries, winning companies. And frankly, the track record is not that bad, but not that good. And we've spent $20 billion as a nation, invested in one big alternative fuel for the future, and probably everyone in this room knows. It is corn-based ethanol. And having just said the 20th century model is to have the government pick winners, and it's not a very good thing, I'm willing to pick a loser, and it's corn-based ethanol. And I just think the energy transfer takes 3 units of fossil fuel input to get 4 units of corn-based ethanol out. The food-fuel trade-off it creates, the stress on water systems that I hope we'll get some more on in a few minutes, makes this a loser for sure. So the government picks winners, not on the basis of market logic or sustainability or ability to meet the needs of society over time, but on short-term political logic that almost always is not a good basis for driving major investments. So I think you see in Connecticut a new approach emerging. Not the government picking winners, not subsidy, but a finance approach, creating a platform for entrepreneurial activity and relying on our limited government resources or ratepayer funds to leverage private capital. Why is that important? First of all, the government doesn't have enough money to do all the projects, to invest in all the infrastructure, and to support all of the efforts that need to be undertaken. Second, and more importantly, relying on the private sector provides a discipline that governments lack in where the money gets spent. So it transforms completely how you deploy your limited resources. And I think Connecticut's already seen a boom in its clean energy flow of capital into efficiency, into renewables, into fuel switching towards cheaper, cleaner, and more reliable natural gas and out of coal and oil in a way that is quite fascinating. And it's not by accident. It does require kind of a new policy framework. So you see in Connecticut not solar RECs and wind RECs, which is the old 20th century model, but a zero-emissions renewable energy credit. It requires all technologies to compete against each other. So you're harnessing market forces, competition in particular, to drive down the cost of renewable energy. And I promise you the single most important factor for whether we get to a clean energy future is the pace at which the cost of clean energy, renewable power in any of its forms, comes toward, approaches, and finally surpasses the price of fossil fuel alternatives, particularly in the generation of power. That's the key to success in this marketplace. And structuring policy incentives to get there is what's absolutely critical. Now, beyond that, Connecticut used a set of reverse auctions to drive down costs. It used power purchase agreements as opposed to a renewable portfolio standard to, again, lower costs. And it turns out that some of the prevailing wisdom of the 20th century just didn't work. a renewable portfolio standard, which Connecticut's had for 15 years, ratcheting up the percent of power that's meant to be renewable up to 20% by 2020, has produced 0 grid-scale renewable energy projects in 15 years. 0. No wind projects, no solar arrays, because it's a target, it's a timetable, it's a command and control approach. It doesn't work. What did work was saying the state would like to purchase renewable energy. All of you who have projects, tell us what you can do and at what cost, and we will give you, if you are the low bidder, a 15 or 20-year contract to sell power in the state of Connecticut. So the number of people that were able to get projects financed when they had a renewable energy portfolio standard to point to in Connecticut, 0. Once you have a contract in hand, you can go to a bank and borrow $100 million to build a wind farm. Very different approach. So we are seeing new tools that work, a more integrated strategy, a focus on a portfolio approach to the future. There will be a fossil fuel dimension to it for some many years to come, but we are at the same time ramping up renewable energy, ramping up efficiency. And by the way, after years of a very slow ramp, we saw a 10-fold increase in the pace at which renewable energy is being deployed at the household scale and the grid scale in the last couple of years as opposed to the years prior to that. We also are seeing a need for integration not only of strategy, but of states. It doesn't work for each state to do this on their own. We're waiting for a national program that's not coming. So you now have the New England states banding together, investing again in a portfolio approach that has the transmission lines being built, has gas pipelines being built, is really designed to ensure that the state is going to be able to benefit from the markets that are out there and the prices that are prevailing in some places. And I just point out natural gas, because of the growing supply, is selling in New York today at prices under the benchmark Henry Hub in the Gulf. The price in New England, double that. This is a bottleneck problem and an infrastructure issue. So the New England states are working together to overcome that. My bottom line, and really what I offer as the key to the 21st century strategy, is the need to think about innovation more broadly than it was in the 20th century. A lot of push was put on technology development, remains important. We want to continue to see venture capital, not so much government money, but venture capital going into breakthrough technologies. But we need innovation as well in finance, which is why Connecticut set up a green bank to do these kind of creative financing. We need creative policies, new frameworks of incentives. We need innovation in how we engage the public, in the marketing of clean energy. So it's innovation broadly in the entire ecosystem of energy that is what's going to get us to a transformed future and is allow us to manage these fast-changing issues that we see around us. Thank you.
Dan, I think we will have a lot of good discussion on winners versus losers, economics trumping others. This portfolio approach is an essential approach, and it's great to see the success that it's helped deliver in Connecticut. And I think clearly, as we talk and look towards China, things like looking at infrastructure and the challenges of distributing to different markets will become a common theme. We will now turn towards China, which is in many ways, you'll tell us if I'm wrong here, the opposite of the U.S., with a strong central planning for an energy system, which in so doing is adding energy capacity more rapidly than any other country in the world. Professor Zhang, perhaps you can tell us something about what we should expect to see happening in the world of energy in the next 10 to 15 years in China, and maybe how that compares a little bit to the rest of the world. Thank you.
Thank you very much. It's really a great pleasure to be here to join the very interesting discussion, and also give me an opportunity to share with you some of our perspectives about China's energy and CO2 emission. And just the moderator mentioned, so I'm very important. I know what his meaning, because China is the largest energy consuming nation in the world. And last year, the total primary energy consumption reached 3.7 billion tons of coal equivalent. And if you look at the mix, the energy supply mix, so we will see still 66% 66% from coal, and also the oil accounted for approximately 19%, and natural gas 5.8%, non-fossil fuels, that means nuclear plus renewables altogether, so it's about 9.8%. So you can see coal and fossil fuels and particularly coal still dominated our energy supply mix. And also for the power generation, so China, the power generation capacity also reached about 12,000 gigawatt last year, and approximately 65% from coal. And natural gas is about 3.5%, and also at the renewable recently for the past 2 decades witnessed a very fast growth. But right now the share is still very low. For example, China is the largest installation nation of wind turbines, but the contribution for power generation is only 5.2%, and the solar energy and the nuclear is about 1.2%. And but for the renewable, the hydro, so for the power generation, the share is very high. It's approximately 21%. So this is the situation of the energy consumption and the power generation. So from this supply mix, we can see it also lead to the China become also the largest carbon dioxide emitter in the world. So and right now we know approximately 1/4 of the total carbon dioxide emission in the world comes from China, and more importantly, approximately 60% of increased carbon dioxide emission from China. So and this is why it happens. So I think it's very much related to 3 major drivers for China's energy consumption and also CO2 emission. So one is the industrialization, the second is the urbanization, the third is the modernization. So because in the near future, these 3 major drivers still in place, so we can expect the China's CO2 emission and energy consumption will keep going up. But we believe the growth rate will be going down. So according to our recent projection, this based on Tsinghua MIT joint research project. So by the year 2020, so China's total energy consumption could be approximately 5 billion tons of coal equivalent, 5 billion. And by the year 2020, it could be 6 billion tons of coal equivalent. So and also, if really in addition to address the CO2 emissions, China have to also address the very serious domestic environmental challenges. So I'm very happy. I'm very thankful for the invitation for me to come here, because I sit here, I get rid of the smoke. So in Beijing, so for this week, Beijing the smoke is very serious. The pollution index is soaring very high. So I should very much thank Mike invited me to get here. So and also to address not only the CO2 emission issues, also the air quality issues. China showed take substantial efforts for to promote the renewable energy and the non-fossil fuels. So according to our projection, so by the year 2020, the non-fossil fuel contribution could be 15%, and by the year 2030, it could be 25%. And so after the year 2030, the increased energy consumption could be supplied by the non-fossil fuels, the nuclear and the renewables, such that China's CO2 emission could peak so at the year 2030. So this is the pictures. But the big challenge is the China's economy, population is very huge. So to address this, the challenges, we take substantial efforts, and also we need, of course, we also need a policy. Yes, we are very centralized planning nation, so China's policy approach is largely top-down. So for the past 10 years, and for example, so we have energy planning exercise from the central government to the county government, the lowest government, so in China, and the critical work of the energy planning is to set legally binding targets for the energy, CO2 emission, and the renewables. So and this target can give a signal and message for mobilizing the social resources to water areas. So I think it's very important. In addition to the national legally, in addition to the targets, and also there is also an approach, it's very unique in China, this aggregating the national targets into provinces. So make the provincial governors and even the large the leaders of the industry be responsible for energy conservation and CO2 mitigation. So and there is an agreement between the government and the major energy consumers and the CO2 emitters. So in China, so this is a so-called command and control approach. But we also recently China learned to use market-based policy instruments. So including the tax policy, and also the bonus and the energy conservation subsidies, investment, and renewable energy, renewable electricity feed-in tariffs, and the electricity surcharge for renewable development. And also recently, so for the past 3 years, China started cap and trade emissions, the carbon dioxide emission cap and trade pilots. So in the 5 cities and 2 provinces, including Beijing. And right now, according to just after, the third party's plenum has already set very directions for further reform China's economy, and also come up with very specific directions for reform China's energy and climate policy. So according to the new reform initiative, China will build a national cap and trade scheme by the year 2020. So, and just yesterday, so I received a call from the National Development Reform Commission would like me to join a meeting next week talking about the setting of the national targets and how to disaggregating the national targets to the provinces, and what kind of key approach to allocate the CO2 emission into enterprises. So, and that means this is a series, because the central government have a roadmap to the central government. The central government or the state council request the national development information to formulate a roadmap. So, and the major work should be finished by the end of this year. So I think this is maybe the so-called top-down approach. So based on China's political system. But I think that this is the story for the recently. But this is the part of the story was recently. But also there is a new, I think, momentum. And because this is the social awareness about environmental pollution and the climate change in China has been raised. As most of the people, and I think because the rise of the social awareness make it possible for more easier to implement China's this climate energy policy. Okay, it's largely due to the smokes. Okay, thank you very much.
Mr. Zhang, I'm struck again by a couple of things. One is that with the central planning approach, the dimensions of change that have been achieved in China in all areas of energy use and dwarfs other economies and other host nations. So it's quite a remarkable achievement. I'm also struck, and some of us listened to Dan's talk last night, another talk on communications, and how you can take different numbers and lots of very interesting facts coming out. One of which is, the tremendous growth in renewables and in solar and others, which is also quite spectacular. At the same time, the growth in coal and the dilemma that creates to meet the societal needs for energy in China, and how do we balance those? So we'll talk about that. But think of that as as you think about rates of market penetration and what it would really take to have a greater percentage, for example, of renewables. It's just it's an important aspect. So now let's continue in places across the globe. Thanks, Karen. That's wonderful. We're going to talk about the largest uses of energy in transportation and electric power. And Karen Hussey will talk about an energy future that has been talked about for many years in electrification and its impact, the electrification, I think, of literally everything. What kind of impact would that have? I'm not sure you're going to address that directly. But is the electric power sector really ready for massive electrification, and how will this likely to affect national energy grids, and what will be the impact on this kind of stress nexus that we talk about with water and energy use and distribution? So, Karen, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you very much. Apologies for not sitting down. I'm much better on my feet. I'm very grateful to be here, so thank you very much to the Yale Climate and Energy Institute. I'm grateful to be here for different reasons to Zhang. He was very pleased to get away from the smoke and the smog. I was very grateful to see some real rain. So thank you very much. I could do without the cold, though. That's a struggle today. So, as Dave said, I was asked to focus particularly on the electricity sector. And today I want to focus on three emerging or continuing developments that affect very strongly our capacity to generate electricity and decisions around where and how we can generate electricity. So I want to discuss those three issues and then conclude very briefly with what I think the consequences might be for electricity production moving forward, particularly the actors involved in the business models that will underpin electricity in the future. So the first issue, which is very close to my heart and which has been touched on already, is the electricity sector's demand for water. And it's my contention and others that this nexus between electricity or energy generally, but electricity particularly, and water is going to place increasing constraints on where and how electricity can be generated. To give you just a very quick sort of précis on that link between energy and water, just consider for a moment that to produce 1 liter of petroleum oil requires anything from 7 to 15 liters of water. To produce natural gas, you're looking at 20 to 50 liters of water per barrel of equivalent oil. And in terms of hydraulic fracking, which is a major concern in Australia and I know in the United States as well, you can be looking at anything from 8 to 30 million liters of water produced per well. Per well. Okay. So the relationship between energy and water is very, very strong. And we're only really starting to come to grips with that now. The risks posed by water to electricity in particular are fourfold. The first is very obvious. It's water availability. Okay? Do we have enough water to be able to cool our power plants, to be able to extract those gas and oil reserves? The second is an increasing ambient water temperature. It's very difficult to use water as a coolant if it's already warm, right? And we have found this to be a real problem in Australia. The third is increasing variability, which exists anyway, but is going to be exacerbated by climate change. And the fourth is not mentioned very much at all in any of the literature, and that is the other impacts of climate change that are going to have an effect on critical infrastructure. So we're seeing increasing cyclones, increasing flooding, and even increasing bushfires in Australia and elsewhere in the world, which is affecting your assets. Right? We're seeing plants destroyed or at least affected by floods, bushfires, cyclones, and the like. And so this is expensive, which will ultimately be passed on to the consumer. So it's a very real problem, and it has very real impacts almost everywhere in the world. We saw a very sort of perverse outcome from the delay in the monsoonal rains in India a couple of years ago, which meant that there was an increased demand for groundwater pumping in the absence of the monsoonal rains, which of course put enormous pressure on the electricity sector in India. We've seen in the United States, in Australia, in France, in Germany, nuclear power plants and other power plants have to shut down and interrupt energy supply because of an absence of available water resources. Okay? So it's a real problem and it's very much alive. Once you throw land into the mix and you bring in the consequences for agricultural production and food prices, all bets are off. And in 2009, we saw what happens when you have a spike in staple food products. I should also point out that there is no particular technology that is immune from this problem. Right? The most obvious is hydroelectricity. Right? But it doesn't stop there. Any kind of thermal power generation is vulnerable to scarce water resources. Anything that uses water as a coolant is vulnerable to increase in ambient water temperature. Okay, fracking is another one. Biofuels, it's off the chart in terms of water resource consumption. So I think understanding the nexus and starting to act on it is going to have three consequences. The first is, we're already seeing this, is we're going to see changes in standards around energy efficiency, around where you can site electricity generation plants. There's going to be a whole suite of water triggers within the regulatory arrangements to ensure that sensible decisions are made. We're also going to see things like cogeneration, where instead of using fresh water resources, we might see desalination used, and we'll just cop the energy cost of that. We may well see more efficient and interconnected electricity markets to promote greater flexibility. Right? We have a national electricity market in Australia, so when we can't use our hydro facility down south, we can buy energy from up north. Right? Now that's great for us, but it's my contention that we might actually see greater, more flexible, competitive, integrated energy markets and electricity markets in places like Southeast Asia, okay, where this issue starts to get more and more live as they develop further. The most exciting aspect of this to me, and I share Dan's enthusiasm about renewable energy technology, is that it just makes that argument to use renewable energy technologies that much more compelling. Okay? Now, the knock-on consequences of that, which I get very tickled pink about, is the potential for distributed energy storage technologies to be a support mechanism to enable that renewable energy penetration. And I don't want to trample all over this afternoon's panel, but suffice it to say that in Australia, in the United States, in parts of Europe, there have been some amazing initiatives just in the last 3 years around pilot projects for distributed energy storage. And what that is precipitating in Australia, at any rate, is new business models. So just this week in Australia, the Macquarie Bank Group applied to be an energy retailer. Right? It applied for electricity retail license. Right? So it's my contention that if we see more renewables, we see more distributed energy storage, we're going to see different actors, different people will be producing energy. Right? And that's going to require a whole shift in our regulatory framework. So that was the second issue. I forgot to start with that. The third issue is the persistent price differentials that exist between regions for electricity. Okay? In Europe and in Japan, they pay at the moment, 3 times as much for their electricity. The World Energy Outlook report from last year suggests that by 2035, they'll still be paying twice as much for electricity as the United States. That has profound implications for energy-intensive production, particularly energy-intensive trade-exposed commodities. So where I think this brings us to, if we take the water, energy, and more recently the land nexus, combined with the penetration of renewable energy technologies and what I think that means for energy storage, plus the potential for greater incentive for integrated grids, more competitive, more flexible integrated electricity grids in places where they're not currently integrated, I think we see a number of consequences. And like Neil, please don't make investment decisions based on this. I think we're going to see fundamental reform and eventually transformation of the electricity sector in a number of ways. We're going to see reform of pricing, particularly to account for the externalities of water impacts. We're going to see new business models, right? New actors, but new risks that come with those new business models. And I'll go into that in detail in question time if you like. I think we're going to see two weird things happen. And as a political scientist, of course, I'm focused on the role of the state and who's doing what. I think we're going to see two things happen. One is we're going to have increasingly decentralized, distributed electricity sectors. So we've got more actors, we've got really innovative, different business models, and we've got distributed energy technologies, renewable plus storage. But I think we're at the international level, we're going to see much more integration and cooperation and collaboration to allow for those very real climate risks and water risks simply to bring about greater energy security. So I think it's an exciting space, and I'm happy to explore any or all of that in questions.
Thank you very much, Karen, and again, appreciation for Travels to share this with us. Clearly reminding us of the importance of water in the energy space, and in many places without water, there is no energy. So I think just extraordinarily important. I'm really interested in the questions as we talk about the risks of these new business models. So one of you remember that question. And I also thought it brought up, in addition to the very fascinating new methods of distribution and so forth of electricity, this need for capital and the importance of capital becoming involved in this, and how that will influence the markets that we have. So thank you again for a very thorough review in a short time. Let's move on to our last, but not least by any means, presenter. Luke, transportation right now is one part of the energy sector where a single source, currently oil, dominates. And again, Neil showed that in his presentation. And really, right now, has a pretty strong lock. Not a lock tight, but a strong lock on usage. In the U.S., for example, I think, and you'll correct me if this is off, it's about 95% of the transportation comes from oil. So can you tell us how you view this changing through time and what some of the drivers might be that would cause that to change? Thanks.
Great. Thank you, David. It's a great pleasure for me to be here. It's an honor to be on this panel, and thanks very much to the Climate and Energy Institute for the invitation. It was nice to learn of our connection, my connection with background that Neil has, and in the sense that we both served in the Navy. One of the things that you learn very quickly as an officer standing watch on the bridge is that when you come across a tanker or a cargo ship out in the ocean, that ship is not going to move its course for you. You're going to move for it. The cruiser that I was on, typical Navy ships, were manned up to go to volatile areas and to change our way of doing business very quickly. We may have, on the ship I was on, we had 600 crew members, including the officers. A tanker or a cargo ship might have 15 or a handful. And so I bring that up from the standpoint that the U.S. obviously is in a sense of the energy world, we're kind of a tanker. You know, we're a huge consumer. China is obviously coming up and passing us in ways, but we can't keep the course steady and expect everyone to move around us. We need to move more like a Navy ship and take advantage of the innovation that we can put forth and help that guide sort of the direction that we take going forward. I'm going to focus on a United States perspective, mainly because that's the area that I work in, but because of the opportunity for us to take really a strong leadership role. As Dave mentioned, you can't talk about the transportation sector and not talk about oil, you know, because it is basically the source of fuel for the transportation sector. In the U.S., the transportation sector is responsible for about 70% of the consumption of oil. And if you look at oil as a primary energy source, it is the number one source of greenhouse gas emissions in the United States. From a climate perspective, why do I work on vehicles and fuels in the transportation sector? Well, the transportation sector it contributes about a third of our pollution, climate pollution nationally, and about 80% of that transportation sector emissions comes from vehicles on our roads. So understandably, they need to be an area of focus as well. I wanted to quickly sort of paint the situation of where we are and some ideas, some points ahead for what the future may look like according to some forecasts. And so the blue box here represents kind of what are expected emissions for the U.S. transportation sector from a CO2 perspective if you're just thinking about what the policies are that are in place right now. And if you look in a 2030 time frame, the red represents kind of the trajectory that we were on, the red dotted line, and you can see that we were headed towards higher emissions. And the green represents really a trajectory that we need to be on to meet an 80% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions by 2050 relative to 2005. So the fact that we're below the red means that we've made some progress. And we should recognize that and think about what it is that's gotten us there. But of course, the fact that we're still above the green means that we have quite a bit of work to do. So when we talk about, you know, sort of how we reduce emissions and oil use in the transportation sector, we focus on, traditionally, it's a solution stool built on 3 legs. Those 3 legs are basically how much fuel our vehicles use per mile that they drive or their efficiency. It's how much do we actually have a demand for driving or our vehicle miles traveled. And third, it's what we put in. What's the carbon intensity of the fuel that we put in? So I'm going to touch on each of those very briefly. Here we have, in the first area, efficiency, we have a great story actually here in the U.S., and this has been a large chunk of where our emission reductions have come from. This chart here is showing the progressions from 2007 out to the present, monthly tabs on it of what the new vehicles, fuel efficiency of the new vehicle fleet is produced in the United States. Now, this just shows the upward trend over the last, since 2007, over the last 7 years or so. But if you were to take this trend back, what you would see is that actually it was just this long, flat period for decades where we didn't increase fuel efficiency standards at all. And actually our fuel efficiency as a new vehicle fuel efficiency was going down because of the shift towards higher fuel use in basically the shift towards SUVs. So this has been a huge policy success. It's been really a landmark program of the Obama administration to put these standards in place, set over 2 stages in 2010 and 2012. But I want to Dan's point about the role of the states, this was leading into this was that a lot of states were using authority under the Clean Air Act to set greenhouse gas emission standards for vehicles leading in to this federal process, and was really a helpful push in that, Connecticut being one of the states that had adopted California's program. And so the states as a laboratory and as a push to get federal policy continues to be very important. This isn't happening just in cars and light trucks, but it's also happening in the heavy-duty sector. And right now the administration is looking at the second phase of fuel efficiency standards for heavy-duty trucks and working on that right now. And so that's going to be a major factor, one of the main pieces that's going to help us close that gap between where we are and where we need to be, even in a 2030 time frame. The VMT picture. For decades, VMT, or vehicle miles traveled, has been on a very rapid rise in the United States. But what we've seen recently is that actually questions being asked by a lot of researchers is whether or not we've sort of peaked. Are we on the way down, actually? And some folks are thinking that on a per capita basis, people are going to actually not drive more, but we actually may continue to see a decline in per capita. And with that decline in per capita, we could see a leveling off of emissions in total demand for driving. And, this is due to a lot of different factors: economics, demographics. No longer is it that everyone has to drive somewhere to meet up when everyone now has a smartphone in their pocket that can can talk to each other via the web. So, a lot of factors are at play here, but it's something that's become a real thing to study in terms of where even the Energy Information Administration is now focused on this, and that what they've looked at is that even in one of their low VMT scenarios, this could reduce petroleum consumption in the transportation sector by like 18%, just this reduced demand in driving, where historically this was just something that was going up, 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 and up. Now, those are pretty positive stories. Let's talk about the fuel sector. Now, this is a less positive story, or let's say it's an area for a lot of opportunity. So this graphic here is emphasizing the fact that we have, as we continue to have demand for petroleum, we're going after harder to reach sources, and we're going after higher carbon intensity sources. So in this case, it's the tar sands from Canada. If that becomes a large portion of the fuel mix, that pushes our transportation sector carbon emissions in the upward direction. So basically, we're counteracting all these things that we're doing with vehicle efficiency or a shift towards electric vehicles. We're counteracting that if we move towards more high carbon intensive fuels. This graphic is focused on highlighting kind of the regional impact. Here in Connecticut and surrounding states, we get about half of our fuel supply from pipeline that comes from the Gulf and refineries from those Gulf refineries. And also we have some refineries in our region. So if tar sands gets to the Gulf, we'll get part of that. It's also as more tar sands moves by rail, or if pipelines get reversed as being talked about in Canada, then we're going to get more tar sands into our regional refineries. That's going to increase the carbon footprint of the fuel supply that we use. Just to give a sense of what that means, we have this really landmark cap-and-trade system, or not cap-and-trade, but a relatively cap-and-trade system on our electricity sector in the region called the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative. Over 5 years, that's projected to reduce emissions by on the order of 11 million metric tons. If we hit what could be projected to be 18% of our fuel supply from tar sands in this region, in 1 year, that'll increase our emissions profile by 10 million metric tons. It would offset essentially what we're trying to achieve in 5 years within the electricity sector. So one of the policy levers that could be that could really help us drive forth towards innovation in the clean fuel sector is something called the Clean Fuel Standard. And what that does is it has a twofold effect. It basically says the carbon intensity of the fuel supply needs to go down over time, and it sets a standard, a performance standard, just like fuel efficiency standards for cars. This would be a carbon intensity standard for fuel. If you set a trajectory of where that has to go down, that shifts investment away from things like carbon-intensive fuels and towards things like electricity for vehicles, potentially non-fuel biomass for biofuels, hydrogen-powered electric bus here. Those examples are things where you're creating a market. So again, you're not dependent on a lot of public money, but you're creating a market that spurs that innovation. And I'm happy to talk more about that as we get to the Q&A. Finally, we have examples of where we really need to be. To meet our long-term climate and energy goals in the transportation sector, we need to shift to electric drive vehicles. The reason for that is that electric drives gives you the best efficiency, but also the fuel there, in this case, plug-in electric vehicles using electricity from the grid, it's the one fuel that's actually getting cleaner over time. We're not going to meet our long-term climate goals unless we clean up both the electricity sector and the transportation sector. So let's do that hand in hand. Let's get the vehicles out there that can actually use the cleaner electricity as we move in that direction. These are vehicles that are cleaner today, but they will only get cleaner over time. And you can't say that for any of the fossil fuel directly, liquid fuels. And this slide also points to a lot of the things that Karen started to raise, and that there's a great interaction between electric vehicles and where the electric power grid is going. And basically, when you talk about electric storage technology, every one of these cars has the potential to be an electric storage technology or to be a mobile, on-demand load that really helps manage the intermittency of renewable power. So hopefully that's a good lead-in for the discussion. Thanks very much for your attention, and I look forward to your questions.
So, quick announcement before we start the questions. Some of you may have received an index card with a pencil from one of the students. That's not for your lunch order. Those are for questions. We'll be collecting them. We will have the mics for questions if you want to voice your question, but we will be collecting the cards. You can write your questions down, and we will feed them to the podium.
Yeah, and again, thanks very much, and thanks, Luke, for showing what I think are some real opportunities, but also the balanced view on some of the challenges that are faced in the transportation sector. I'll open it up in just a second for maybe the panelists want to ask each other some questions. But if you don't mind, I'd like to just take the bully pulpit here and just have the chance for maybe the first one. And I wondered in the audience, as you listened to Neil's presentation on these different scenarios, whether that created any kind of tension or stress within you as you looked at, did you think those scenarios were real, or what was the context of those in the fact base? And again, what's the kind of the belief system that you bring to looking at that data? Because one of the things that they all showed was an increase to meet the energy demands, and as I think you highlighted in China, for the continued use of fossil fuels. So I wanted to ask the panelists, just in view of that discomfort, because that takes you to a certain point with CO2, where do you see as the greatest opportunities for true disruptive technologies, policies, innovations and breakthroughs that could change some of those scenarios that Neil presented, and where would you focus your efforts now? And I'll open that to the panel.
I'm happy to start. I think that working at NRDC, obviously we're an environmental advocacy organization. You can't go to work every day and think that we're not going to be able to solve the the very challenging problems that we have in front of us with regard to meeting our climate targets. So I guess what first thing that struck me was, and that was the tie into my ship analogy, was that we can't be satisfied with that as the direction. We have to look towards this innovation, and so I think, and this is consistent with some of Dan's points earlier. We need to set up a framework, especially in our fuel system, that it's not, the Clean Fuel Standard doesn't pick a fuel. It opens up a market for anybody that comes along and wants to compete in that market. And this is a policy that's actually in place in California today. They call it a low carbon fuel standard. And what's interesting in that is that the regulated entities are the refiners, and they have to provide fuel that is lowering its carbon intensity over time. But one of the main players in that market right now are the electric utilities, because they're creating credits because they're selling electricity to power vehicles. They create credits that could be available to the market for the refiners to buy. And that's creating, basically, it's moving towards providing more financial incentives for the utilities to encourage more people to get into electric vehicles. And you have this self-fulfilling sort of turnaround where you can use that as a way of accelerating this technology. And the last slide I had up there, I titled it Clean Energy. It's our future today with this plug-in electric vehicle, because it is a technology that is here today. And the issue that we really have is how do we accelerate it? And, driving an electric vehicle is equivalent to driving on national average electricity prices. It's equivalent to driving on the equivalent of $1 a gallon gasoline. Who doesn't want that? That's a real payback. And so the question is, how do you get over that upfront cost of the vehicle? And things like this nexus with the electricity sector can help deal with some of those things.
Was impressed by the array of ideas that our panel put forward. And so, Dave, I hate to pick on you, but I actually think the question you asked is the question people asked in the 20th century, and we tried to guess answers. And I actually reject the question. Smart people shouldn't be guessing. We should be trying these out and doing more of what works, and we need to be more empirical. And we need innovation in every arena. And we need to see what's going to break through, who's going to bring costs down so that we can compete with the status quo and eventually displace it. And I think the great joy is that the smart people in this arena, including you yourself, don't have to guess, because we're seeing so much breaking through on the ground. And that's what I'm excited about. I'm excited to see so many companies out there trying out new approaches. And again, not just products, but services and efficiency improvements and a whole wide array of things. So I think the key is, and I think it's, again, a theme that emerged here, is trying to ensure that we have the incentive structure in place that will facilitate that boom in idea testing in the marketplace. And I do think it's around financing. And, we had Luke say, you want to make sure that the choice of the electric vehicle, which could be a superior option, doesn't come at a huge premium to your next best alternative. So that's why I think the innovation in finance is particularly important, not just in terms of vehicles, but in terms of getting every building improved to the greatest extent possible. If it can be done with a no upfront cost package of financing and a positive cash flow loan, you're going to get a lot more people to step up and do it. So I want to have a broad view of where breakthroughs are going to come. And try lots of things out and do more of what works and pull back on the things that don't.
In relation, yeah, you're probably going to reject my answer. So, I have sort of two cautionary remarks about scenarios. Where is Neil? Where is he? No, is he gone? He's gone, is he? Oh, I can say what I like. So, I think they're dangerous. Oh, he's coming back. Better not. Scenarios are enormously useful for providing alternative visions. But my fear with all scenarios, but even when I look at the Shell scenarios, is twofold. One is we never get it right. Right? So they provide these alternative visions. But if you go back to what we were talking about 30 years or 40 years ago and what they projected was going to happen, it didn't. Right? It's always off course, sometimes wildly. Okay? And that in itself is okay. Right? We still need somebody laying out some well thought out scenario analysis. And Shell does a very good job, as does the International Energy Agency, et cetera, et cetera. But where I get really concerned is that if you look at either of those scenarios, they're both really depressing. Right? And I think it's often used by those that want to maintain the status quo as an opportunity to say, well, look, we shouldn't really make this move because clearly all the indicators are suggesting that we would be screaming in the wind. Right? There's another expression, but I'm not allowed to use that. So I think when we look at the scenario analyses, we need to just say, very useful, but let that not cloud the vision and innovation that can come. If we say all bets are off, let's look at what the indicators are saying. And as all of us, I think, have said, there's tremendous optimism. Let's focus on the optimism.
Thanks, Karen. Zhang?
Our team has also do a lot of scenario work. So as a professor, I often told my students, please do your best to avoid rubbish in and rubbish out. So that means that the assumptions, and in addition to the methodology, the modeling framework itself, the assumptions and also the understanding of the issues, so it's very important. So, and in the context of China, for to the China energy scenario and CO2 emission scenario, the challenge is very huge. So so I think for the China's the energy consumption and the CO2 emission future, a lot of uncertainties. So we should be carefully and a lot of uncertainties. So far we have not maybe it's beyond our capacity to deal with this. So one is the China's economic for China for the China's energy future. I think very much the largest uncertainty is the economic growth. So according to our estimation, so 0.1% of increase in the economic growth in the annual economic growth would lead to 1 billion tons of CO2 emission added per year 2030. So this is very big. So the economic growth rate change a little bit, it will lead to a very significant CO2 emission and energy consumption. So in the context of China, so in the past, the past 2 decades, China pursued a high economic growth rate. The economic growth rate on average is over 10%. So the economic growth rate is very high, but also the economic cost is very high. So that's why we have smokes. So it's a very big problem to threaten the life of the people. So and in the future, so now the government would like to have a shift, and also from the shift would like to pursue a relatively low but sustainable growth rate. This is at the central government level's idea, but usually, so the local government, they have a different idea. So their major motivation is the economic growth rate. How make it really happens? So I think it's a very big uncertainty. So another uncertainty in context of China is related to the coal. So in China is a big coal. The coal resource is abundant. So there is a lot of discussion. So in China, if we can use the coal in a clean way, and the China they have a lot of their big research and development program on the poly generation and the CCS, etc. So it also, I think, this kind of research and technology, so it's also there is a uncertainty. So if we get a breakthrough, it makes we can have come up with we have a reliable and environmentally friendly way to use the coal, it will be it's also will change China's energy supply mix. So during right now we are in China, we also very much would like to see when should the peak, the coal consumption peak could occur in China, because most of the environmental problem and also CO2 emission problem associated with the coal. So now there is a community in China to push the coal consumption be peak as far as soon as possible. But other people also, maybe scientists, maybe also that technology. So I think another uncertainty is about is associated with China's grid. So if really the smart grid, the technology be available and be get through recently, soon, so this make the solar PV technology be really be widely used in the cities. So I mean, I think this is of course the policies, and if the really determination of the government, if they can really push so these policies, they have some ideas with some directions. Okay.
Thank you very much. Let me open it up to the panel, since you've done all the work here, to ask whatever questions that you may have for each other.
Fuel performance standard, and the aim here is to assess carbon intensity. To what extent could that fuel standard also assess land switching and water intensity as well? Because if you focus on carbon alone, we're just going to create other issues.
One of the things that the California system has been looking at, and we feel needs to go further, is a more general sustainability metric related to the fuel. So, and that's where you would start to roll in water usage, and I think even you can get into human rights issues. You can go quite a ways there. Fortunately, there are standards now, like the renewable RSB, the Renewable Sustainable Biofuels Roundtable on Sustainable Biofuels, which is an international standard for certification. So there is an opportunity for companies to go and follow this protocol. And the question is, that right now is a good model. Do we need to continue to extend it? And I think absolutely we do need to look at that. So just the focus on carbon is an important piece, but it can't be, we would agree that it can't be the only piece.
Okay. Thanks. I've got some great questions here. I don't know if you have one other. No, go ahead. I'm just giving you your mic. Here's one that I think is quite good. What do you think just an interesting hypothetical, what do you think the impact of carbon tax law in the U.S. would be on China export, and also on, to you, American economies and way of life? So I'll start with you. So how big do you think that this would have an impact if there was a carbon tax in the U.S. on China export and the influence of that, and then to you on the economy and the ways of life?
So I do think, so if the U.S. have a carbon tax law, so it will be affect some export from China to the United States. So I think so my perspective is that I don't know when it could be happen in the United States. Yeah. So when the U.S. carbon tax law could be happened. So if it's 2 years, 1 year, of course it will be a very important impact. If it will be 10 years, 20 years, I think that time China will be very prepared. So I think that if for right now, I think there's some impact. So
can you comment just on the chance of a carbon tax in China?
Yeah, the carbon tax. So we so right now, just I mentioned, we already have 7 pilots. So in 5 cities and in the 2 provinces right now, you see. So in the Beijing, for example, so the carbon tax, the carbon price. So in Beijing's carbon trade system, and right now is $10 per ton. It's much higher so than at the beginning. So so according to the roadmap of China's policy roadmap, climate policy roadmap, by the year 2020, so we will have a national carbon cap and trade system. So at the time the carbon price could be as high as $20 by the year 2020. It's also possible. So.
So one of the things I think is interesting in this climate change arena is how broad the base of support for some kind of a price. And when we say carbon, we really mean carbon equivalent, so all greenhouse gas emissions and beyond. And I think that the fact that you have policymakers and economists from really across the political spectrum agreeing that this is the optimal policy pathway, and yet politically in the United States it's proven to be extremely difficult, is worth pausing over and thinking about. And Dr. Zhang is, demonstrated that there are other places that face a similar problem where this is being moved forward. And China is doing a number of things to put a price on carbon that I think deserve study, and we probably have something to learn in regard to how this plays out. I think that there will be a price in one way or another on carbon over the next decade at some point. And I think it will affect the flow of exports out of China to the United States, because at least on the margin, it will make it more economical to produce some things back in the United States that are now being imported from China. And I think it's a fair point that you would hate to see this done over a year or two because it's jarring to the economy. But if it's implemented out over a 5 or 10 year period, I think China will adjust. And China's own economy is maturing. It's increasingly producing for a domestic marketplace. And of course, there's great interest in the United States in insourcing, in bringing back manufacturing to the United States. And there are good reasons to think that's going to happen anyway as a result of the low cost, particularly natural gas that's increasingly available for some sectors of the economy. So I think the likely economic impact is modestly to affect exports from China to the United States, modestly to increase production in the United States, and if done with the right time frame, doesn't have to be jarring to anyone.
Thank you, Dan. Thank you very much. I'll stick with questions from the audience for a bit. This is to Karen, to you. Will greater usage of electric fuel vehicles place more or less stress on water consumption?
Where the electricity is being generated from. Right? So in and of itself, the electric vehicle industry then just becomes another user of electricity, and you've got to go back to source. Where are you getting your electricity from? So ideally then you would say, well, there's greater pressure on the electricity sector, so you want to try to take the pressure off that. Again, I think it just provides another reason to try to look at those energy generation technologies that take the pressure better in terms of water, land, climate risk, vulnerability. So to me, it would just be another reason to look carefully about your energy generation mix.
Thank you.
We should think about electric vehicles and how we do them, how we implement them to be a strategy that can help promote the types of generation, solar, wind, that don't have the same kind of water impacts that other central fossil fuel infrastructure would, and it's absolutely a great role for them in that case.
I wondered to the panel how, because we talked a little bit about it this morning, how can we reconcile both the challenges and the opportunities created by local planning, regional planning, national, international, and where again do you see the opportunities for that, and what gets in the way of the implementation? And Dan, maybe I'll start. I mean, you've had direct experience with this. How do you see this moving forward?
So I think one of the interesting developments over the last few years in the United States, but really around the world, is the growing action agenda on climate change that's been cascaded from national governments to state and provincial governments, and perhaps even now more to cities. And I think this is a very positive thing. So I think action on energy, push for clean energy, does require investments on the ground. It requires people to actually do things. And I've actually long been worried about a framework at the international level that focuses entirely on setting targets and timetables at a nation-state level. I think it would be much more interesting if we had targets and timetables at the state and provincial level, at the city level, and frankly, for corporations, perhaps set by industry cluster. One of my experiences in my work in this arena over now 20 years is that people are best motivated by a structure that has clear reporting on a common methodology and allows for scorecarding, but not against all countries in the world for the national level, but against similarly situated nations. And I think likewise you could benchmark states and provinces against each other, similarly situated, and companies by industry cluster. And I think you could actually get a lot done by driving the action orientation, the investment decision making, the planning process to those multiple levels and have them in effect compete against each other to see who can perform the best. That benchmarking scorecarding allows you to identify leaders and laggards, identify best practices, and one of the best strategies is simply to extract best practices from a careful analysis and then disseminate them more broadly.
Thank you. Karen, I saw you nodding to that, so
Last year I ran a project that was funded by, I live in Canberra, which is in the Australian Capital Territory, and everyone thinks Sydney is the capital, but it's not. Canberra is the capital. And it's a much nicer city, and look me up if you're ever there. But we ran this project that was funded by ActuAGL, which is our local energy and water utility combined. It's a unique company in Australia for that reason. And they came to us and they said, look, we're going to put some money into a pilot project to do smart metering, energy storage at the grid and the residential scale. Basically, everything that's new, we're going to pump into this pilot project, and we just want to see what happens. And what they wanted us for was to specifically look at the barriers or impediments to the penetration of distributed energy storage into their aspect or their part of the national electricity market. And it was a fascinating study because it basically every part of our regulatory schema or landscape is designed to support centralized energy supply. And there were very, very good reasons for that. A lot of it was around security of supply or public health, management and maintenance of assets. But when you talk about distributed renewable energy and distributed energy storage, it totally changes the scale at which energy is generated and used. And that means that you have to change your, the laws have to change in order to allow for these distributed energy generators. But for ActuAGL's purposes, they were like, how do we stay viable? As a centralized electricity supplier, we pay for what the consumer pays, but ultimately through us, we pay for the pipes and the poles and the wires, we pay for the plants. And now you're saying that over the coming decades, we're going to have little bits and pieces of assets at the residential or the regional or the suburban scale that we may not own. So how are we going to manage that? We may end up with stranded assets. Right? This is we, the electricity utility company. We might have all of these poles and pipes and wires that are not necessary in 20 years' time because people in the ACT have really embraced renewable energy and they will really embrace energy storage. So for them, it's about what is our business going to be in 15 years? And therefore, what do we need to be lobbying for now to make that feasible? And it's quite fascinating because it is already seeing our regulatory arrangements change.
Can I just add a thought to that? Because I think Karen's actually said something that represents one of the most interesting areas where things are going to be totally different over the next 15 years from where they are today, and that is in the utility arena. I think the business model for these utilities all over the world is going to be radically shifted. And the smart ones, and it sounds like you have one that you've been working with, are thinking about this and trying to get some on-the-ground experience so that they can make smart decisions about what the revenue streams of the future would look like. As a professor, I can't help but give everyone a homework assignment here. If you want to see what this is doing in the United States, look for the CEO of our second biggest fossil fuel utility, NRG, a guy named David Crane, who 3 weeks ago wrote a letter to shareholders which talks about this revolution that's coming of distributed generation, household-scale power production, and a need for his business, NRG in particular, but the utility industry more broadly, to totally transform over the course of the next couple of decades. And I am awed by David Crane's willingness as a CEO in a very tough conservative business and as the representative of a very traditional utility to lay out a picture that suggests change is coming and you really have to get your arms around it. So it's a 3-page letter, but absolutely brilliant, and I think gives you some insight onto what the smart folks looking at this are doing. And Dave, to your question, it's actually really interesting where you see the planning coming from the utilities about what their world is going to look like in the future.
Thanks very much for that. I wondered if there's a
follow-up to that direct thing.
Sure, Mike.
Graduate of Yale School of Forestry and Environmental Studies, Brian Mars, who works at NRG, was here. And one of the things he said, the challenge of that model is that the people that are relying most on the standard electric utility grid in the U.S. are the less affluent. And we risk, as that model evolves, of leaving them behind. Do you have a comment on that, Dan? I would only say, and we probably get Luke to talk about this too, but almost everything that moves the ball forward in terms of good policy frameworks to address energy and the environment has a regressive impact. That is to say, it's easier for those who are relatively affluent to address the change and to invest in the new approach, and relatively burdensome to the poorer segment of society. So all of this policy framework needs to have a separate track that asks, how do we ensure that we bring along the low-income segment of society? And we're going to need to have special programs to ensure that this is not going to have a severe regressive impact on what is, at least in this country, already a society that the wealthy are doing very well and the middle class are not doing so well and the poor are doing very poorly. So I think it's a fair question, and I would just argue you don't not do these new policies because they might be regressive, but you have to have a separate track that addresses that problem frontally.
And I can give you an example from the United Kingdom. I can't remember the financial house that did it, but they've established interest-free loans for, in the UK they have commission housing flats. So interest-free loans for those commission council-run housing flats to buy and install solar PV panels at that scale, which then allows them to generate their own electricity and bypass the electricity pricing from your centralized electricity supply. And if they generate more, then they become a seller. And it was specifically designed to address the lower socioeconomic strata of society. So there are people thinking about how this can be combated. And interesting, in the UK case, it came from a bank, essentially.
And I'll just quickly add that we're part of an effort in California where we partnered with some environmental justice groups and other groups representing lower income folks out there. When you think about people that are lower income people, their transportation costs are probably a much bigger percentage of their overall income versus the more affluent folks. So actually, for an electric vehicle for them makes more sense than anybody else, right? Because the per mile costs are so low. So it really is this question of how do you get over that upfront piece? And so we're partnering with some of these groups to, in this case, ensure that there's long-term funding out of the California cap and trade system that specifically addresses some of these issues.
Thanks, Luke. Is there another question out in the audience? Yeah.
Working? Yeah, you got it on there. Question about energy economics. Generally, energy costs are rising and we need cheaper energy. For decades, and going off a little bit here for explanation, for decades the US dollar has acted as the world's reserve currency, but in an effort to reduce trading costs, including for energy trading, it's been reported that China has begun direct currency trading with several countries in the past 2 years. This includes Australia, which commenced direct currency trading in April 2013, 1 year ago. So my question, specifically for China and Australia, if you could speak to it, have you seen reductions in energy costs because of this? And I realize this might be a little off topic, but I thought I would ask because you're here.
Currency trading, where energy costs have gone up in recent years. Electricity costs have gone up in recent years, and that's because we spent the last 10 years building, more plants and more poles and wires. Right, so we're now paying for the capital expenditure that was expended in the last decade. I've got no idea how that relates to currency trading, but I'm looking forward to hearing Zhang's answer.
My observation, I don't, because right now, so this part, the amount is relatively small. So I don't think it has a very important impact on China's energy costs and the price right now.
Thank you. Another question from the audience, please.
Yeah, wait for the mic. Zhang, this is a follow-up on your smog comment. So for the people in China and for the government, what is the greatest driver of future energy change? Is it climate change, or is it, in fact, the public health concerns related to the detrimental air quality?
Okay, so I think in the context of China, we have a lot of challenges. The most of the challenge is, I think, because we need to development. So the economic growth, the increased energy needs is very high. How to meet this is a very important issue, because the increased energy is very high. So in the world, in China and also in the world, no cheap energy resources are available. So that's why we have China to have very important motivation to promote the energy, to increase the energy efficiency, to promote the energy conservation. I think it's a very important motivation. Another, of course, is the local air quality. So the people, so it's in dangerous environment. So and people most recently complain a lot. So I think it's very important. Another, and also climate change. So because climate change policy also have a significant co-benefits. So this also very much in line with the China's domestic interests. That's why China, the climate policy and energy policy, so can be promoted, can be implemented much easily. So in the context of China. Okay.
Thank you. I'd like to just ask a question because we haven't talked that much about it, which is probably the biggest change in the world energy has been the advent of unconventional natural gas. This was driven largely by the private sector and infusions of large amounts of capital. From your standpoint, Dan, in Connecticut, I mean, you really helped move this forward in a way that would be advantageous to the state. I'm interested in how you see that going in the future. Do you see it playing an ever-increasing role or a lesser role? And then I'm very interested in China from the standpoint of how do you see gas economically competing with coal as we look forward in the next because that's going to be such a crux aspect. And then finally, Luke, maybe you can talk about the use of natural gas. This is a question that we have in vehicles and how that might play a role. So, Dan, you've had the immediate perspective on this. Maybe you can comment on that.
So as I said earlier, I think one of the keys to success in moving towards a clean energy future is to have that clean energy future be not just clean, but cheap and reliable. And I think the push to expand natural gas in Connecticut was in the spirit of the best option for cheaper, cleaner, and more reliable, at least over the next decade or two. But I continue to see natural gas as really a bridge to a cleaner energy future. And I think this is why I've tried to emphasize, and I think you agreed, and I think a lot of us believe, that a portfolio approach is the right thing, and that we want to have our best fossil fuel option be at the forefront over the next couple of decades. but not take the push off for an even cleaner future beyond that with a real ramp up of renewables. And one of the things I guess I haven't said that I should have emphasized earlier is the key, I think, from the government policy point of view, is to try to drive deployment of clean energy at scale, because that's how you really will bring down cost as well as driving further innovation and breakthroughs. And so I do see natural gas playing a major role, a growing role in the United States and elsewhere out over the next couple of decades, but then peaking and tailing somewhere out over the 20, 30-year time frame.
Thank you. Thank you. Zhang, coal and natural gas in China.
And also just driven by the local air quality issues, the smokes, and now China. So and the use of natural gas has been increased significantly. So before we're talking about the future possible use of natural gas in China. So it's about the use in the households for the cooking and also for some material of the industry. So chemical industry, we never think about for power generation, for space heating. But right now, so I think a very important change. And so the natural gas, they have more opportunities used, so in the power generation and also in the space heating. So, and according to the recent regulation in Beijing, no coal-fired power plants could be built. If you want to invest in Beijing for power generation, you only can use natural gas power plants, can invest natural gas power plants. And also, within the fourth ring of Beijing, for space heating, before it's a coal boiler, but right now you have to shut down and replaced by natural gas. I think that's why the use of natural gas has been increased significantly amount. So and this is the situation. But most of this use, space power generation and space heating, is heavily subsidized by the government. And only the rich government like Beijing, so the government, they have money, they can subsidize. But for other cities, maybe the story is difficult. So I think this is the trend. And right now, the most competitive use of natural gas, so maybe it's used for the trucks, heavy duty trucks, and the taxis and the buses. So in the cities. So this is the situation. I think the cost, so it's a very important limitation. So for the actually utilize the utilization of the natural gas.
Thank you. Luke, maybe you could address the heavy-duty vehicle use of natural gas and other use.
Yeah, certainly. I think that when we talk about expansion of natural gas, I think we do need to recognize that there are questions and a lot of research going around what the current extraction technologies are and what's the impact from a total greenhouse gas life cycle perspective of using natural gas with the way that we're extracting it. You know, primarily methane leakage, and I think that that's a problem that we can cost effectively deal with, but we need to deal with it because, you know, natural gas has a lower, lower carbon content than coal, but we want to make sure that we actually achieve that lower carbon content. And when it comes to vehicles, we see natural gas, especially in the light-duty vehicle sector, a more effective use of it is to put it into a power plant and then that's displacing a coal power plant and then power electric vehicle for it, because the electric vehicle is so efficient that you're going to get a better environmental footprint through that use of natural gas as opposed to directly putting it into an internal combustion engine. And I think the other thing we have to think about is where do we need to be from a long-term perspective in our vehicle fleet? Well, we need to get to electric drive. So again, that should be where our focus is. Now, in the heavy-duty sector, the use of electricity to drive heavy-duty vehicles it's got more challenges in terms of just the energy that's required, the density of that energy that's required. And so natural gas is actually, starting to see a resurgence of use within heavy-duty vehicles. And I think that that's likely to be a growing market, although I think overall natural gas within the transportation sector will continue to be a pretty small slice.
take about 5 more minutes of questions. Some of our panelists have some commitments, and we've had a good discussion. So knowing that there's only 5 more minutes and knowing that you don't want to walk out of here saying, I wish I'd asked that question, are there any burning questions? There is one. Good. From the back, please.
Thank you. See how burning it is. I have a question for Professor Zhang. We know that as China really is wanting to clean up the air, we also see a lot of new coal gasification plants and moving power plants away from the urban centers, therefore increasing carbon intensity and transmission loss. So I'm wondering, both for short-term and long-term, how much of the coal benefits do you see we can actually claim? Thank you.
So and yeah. so there is this is because of this burning question because there is a lot of debates and arguments in China about the coal gasification for the coal gasification for natural gas. So the coal to gas. So so there's I think so there is a moment mainly the moment, mainly from the coal industry. And of course, it's also associated with the air quality, cleaning. So, but I think there is another voice is to make the policy, China policy, very in the future be cautious. So it's also involved a lot of the water issues and also the energy efficiency issues. And from the life cycle analysis perspective, so if the coal to gas and be used, so the efficiency there was a significant penalty, and also the CO2 emission. So it's a very big issue since that there are some recently. So there are government there's some discussion. I think now the targets for the coal to gas is very cautious. I don't think it will be a very big amount of coal to liquids. Coal to gas could be happens in China. Okay.
Thank you very much. I think we'll have time for one more that I can address to the panel, and that's come from the group. And that is, we've talked a lot about distributed generation technology that we touched on. The question that I have is, if you look at the utility structures of the U.S., China, Australia, other areas, how do they compare in the ease of adapting distributed generation technologies? What do you see as, is it easier someplace, less easy, why, and how would it vary in the different regions that we've talked about? What could help make this breakthrough?
So I think it depends a lot on how invested people are in an existing infrastructure that they're going to have to write off, which is, I think, what we heard as well from Australia. And frankly, I think the two critical questions here are, one, are there policy incentives put in place that help this transition? And two, and maybe even more important, is there leadership within that utility sector, business leadership, that helps us get towards the future you've described?
So in the context of China, as we know, so we have two very two very big, two big grid companies. One is the national state grid company, and on the South China grid company. The only two grid company. So particularly the state grid companies, they are big monopoly. So in the transmission and the distribution. So I think for China, a very important barrier is the institutional barrier. So for the use of the distributed system, in the past, China pushed a lot for the diffusion, the use of the distributed system, but the progress is very limited. Right now, is a good news. It seems that so the situation is getting better. So under the pressures of the society, the whole society, and also there is a lot of discussion about how to reform the China's the electricity system. So I think maybe more and more regulations will be specifically tolerant for the to the use of the distributed system, particularly the solar PV system in the cities. So it seems we have to do this. Yeah.
Thank you very much. Now, I know we haven't been able to get to all the questions. We tried to get through most of them, and I hope you've enjoyed the discussion and learned as much as I have from the discussion. I'd like to thank each of our panelists for the quality of your discussion and the material that you brought here, for your travels, and for sharing it with us. And it's been a real pleasure, so thank you very much.